Hello and welcome to today's compliance conversation. My name is Jonathan Greenstein, and I'm joined by two of my expert colleagues from Thistle Initiatives, Alex Vachalis, Director of Investments, and Dorian Cameron, Senior Compliance Manager with our investments team, who both lead on our M&A projects. Today's discussion, regulatory due diligence, navigating the compliance landscape when acquiring a wealth management firm, is actually quite timely. Last week, AKG, an independent research consultancy, released a study titled Future Advice, State of Flux. This study revealed insights from an advisor survey where 65% of advisors anticipated an increase in M&A activity in advice firms, with 21% expecting rapid expansion. Conversely, only 14% foresee a slowdown or halt to this trend. These findings are consistent with our observations of high activity among consolidator firms, although we have noticed some downward pressure on value multipliers. The AKG research also identified key concerns for advisors regarding their business operations. The primary issues were marketing costs and client acquisition challenges, political or geopolitical uncertainty, and regulatory or legislative changes. The study suggests that advisors believe increased regulations and the widening advice gap are driving the need for technological solutions and economies of scale. This necessity presents a significant investment challenge for smaller firms to remain competitive. Regarding regulatory aspects, the introduction of the consumer duty and the 6 individual conduct rule, which focus on delivering positive outcomes for retail customers, are noteworthy. Additionally, the FCA stance is evident in their examination of corporate structures, including the regulatory capital. We have also seen the regulatory focus, including sub-15 notifications related to trade and asset purchases. In general, the regulator is being more assertive. Now, given the FCA's interest over recent years in firms with extensive legacy defined benefit pension transfer advice, or those advising on high-risk products, it's crucial for businesses considering sale or acquisition to understand these regulatory concerns. They should be prepared to demonstrate compliance with the consumer duty and fair customer treatment, addressing how they will manage potential legacy liabilities before approaching the FCA. So while the ongoing advice market is challenging, the M&A space is very busy. Now, at the start of this discussion, I briefly mentioned who we are joining on our panel today, but I wanted to give them a brief chance to introduce themselves and their backgrounds. Alex, over to you.
Hi, so I've been in the financial space since the mid-90s, coming from predominantly a derivatives background through to running the investments compliance team at Thistle Initiatives for, the last 8.5 years now. As my colleague said, we found ourselves involved in a very large amount of regulatory due diligence in the M&A space, particularly in the last 2 years, where it has really gained considerable momentum. So much so that the regulator is now very much increasingly involved with the overlay of consumer duty and so forth as well. Handing over to my colleague.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Dorian Cameron. I've been with Thistle Initiatives for about 4.5 years now, and together with Alex, lead up the M&A team. So my role is primarily liaising with acquirers and target firms to ensure that our reports that we produce provide a fair assessment of the regulatory risks attached to any proposed transaction, as it were. We work on both buy and sell side transactions, and I think that gives us a unique insight, really, into the process, particularly where a firm has issues but is still intent on pursuing a transaction. But we're looking forward to the discussion this morning.
Thank you, both of you. So, to briefly introduce Thistle Initiatives, we are a specialist governance, risk and compliance consultancy that has been supporting financial services firms for the last 10 years now. Our team of expert compliance consultants guide firms through the FCA's authorization process, provide ongoing support, and support firms across the length and breadth of the regulated financial services industry. Before we jump into the discussion today, we would like to ask a poll of our audience. So what we'll do is we'll launch the poll very quickly now. And the poll question is, are you looking to acquire a firm in the next 12 months? If you could please take a few moments to answer it, either yes, no, or not sure. And then we will share the results on screen. Give it a few moments more. Perfect. So we'll close it off now and we'll share the results. Perfect. Thank you very much.
That's interesting to see 61%. That's possibly higher than I was expecting in this particular forum, but by the same token, it does, in many respects, it bears out your introductory comments, Jonathan, regarding the buoyancy in the M&A space at the moment.
Thanks, Dorian. And thank you to everyone who responded to that poll. Now, with this in mind, I'd like to please ask Alex and Dorian to start today's discussion.
Okay, so the areas that we're going to be covering throughout the agenda, we've essentially broken it into 5 areas. We've got the understanding the importance of regulatory due diligence, the key regulatory considerations, navigating compliance landmines, and we'll run through a few best practices and case studies. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to field questions that we would like to answer.
Thanks, Alex. As Alex mentioned, there is the ability to raise questions on the during the presentation, so please feel free to do that, and we'll get to those. But the first topic that we are looking to address is really understanding the importance of regulatory due diligence in the acquisition of a regulated firm. And initially, what our thinking was is that really any acquirer or anyone considering an acquisition needs to be fairly clear in their own mind why they are actually entering the space, and particularly what their post-acquisition strategy is going to be. That's particularly important because in many respects, the actual acquisition of the firm is the easy step in the integration or the acquisition integration process. So in addition to giving some thought to what your post-acquisition strategy is, you will need to consider what your risk tolerance is in that regard. And then to assist, I suppose, which is where we would come in, is to try and ensure that the firm that you are going to acquire is actually the firm or the type of firm that you were intending to acquire. So what we'll do is we'll just run through a number of considerations that we feel are relevant for you to be aware of in embarking on this journey. And they are fairly disparate. So if we start with something like the potential for legacy advice issues in a firm and how much attention you're going to be paying to that. Now, obviously, the structure of the deal that you enter into may have an impact on the relevance of those sorts of things, but tied in too with the risk aspect may be your consideration for how you would approach the presence of self-employed advisors in a particular firm. So those individuals who may not technically own the client, but have the long-standing trusted advisor status with those clients and where they feature once the acquisition has been progressed.
Other key areas, for example, the firm you're acquiring, has it had or does it have any appointed representatives underneath it? Because as we know, the principal firm has responsibility going forward. The appointed rep is seen in law as an exempt person. So when you are making that acquisition, even though they may not have any ARs currently, did they have any a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? Acquiring a firm that has had or has ARs literally includes acquiring the liability that principal firm has in respect of those ARs, and that covers the whole gamut. suitability, complaints, high-risk products, financial promotions, AML. So literally the due diligence that you're doing on that firm that you're looking to acquire, you need to extend that consideration down through to the ARs that, as I say, may not any longer be there, whether they're wound up or whatever it is. A complaint comes in the future, it's going to be that principal firm that you've now acquired that has that liability. On the flip side, acquiring an AR itself can have the potential advantage that, subject to the agreement terms that may have been in place between principal and AR, the liability is actually left with the principal. So these are all considerations that need to be looked at when conducting due diligence. Likewise, on a wider scale, as opposed to single entities, we do conduct due diligence on firms or groups of firms where there may be dozens of entities within it and many dozens of appointed reps. So it can get really quite complicated, but it's absolutely key to know where the liability sits.
You might also want to take a very close look at the client demographic of the target firm in relation to how that might dovetail into your strategy. I suppose the example that springs to mind is if you're looking at a firm where the average age is perhaps over 65, and your proposed future strategy and the synergies that you're looking to achieve are driven primarily by having an app-based interaction with those clients, you might find, and no slight on Silver Surfers out there, you might find that it's going to be a little bit more challenging to make those synergies work than might otherwise be the case. There are also other considerations which I'm sure will not come as a surprise in terms of whether the target firm aligns with your current advice model. And I'm thinking specifically here, whether you have a whole of market or independent approach. And there are a number of IFAs who are proudly independent and perhaps regard that as their unique selling point, versus those who are just as proudly restricted advisors and run very successful businesses based on that outcome. Their view essentially being that as long as we are fulfilling the client's needs and meeting their investment objectives, they really aren't hung up on the fact that they might not be getting independent advice.
Another key consideration is the culture. The culture fit is very important. As my colleague said, we also work a lot of the time on sell side, possibly a quarter of the time, and sometimes with small firms, retiring IFAs and so forth. At the one level, you've got it where they don't want to be in a situation where they do retire and they're meeting their clients down the golf club, and it's the case of who did you sell me to. On the flip side, when you're looking at the actual making the acquisitions, let's take it away from that much smaller firm on the much larger firms, it can be a deal breaker, or even worse, actually, sometimes post-acquisition, it can be a rude awakening if it hasn't been dealt with in the run-up. And it can quite often just be a case that its communication is broken down throughout the process. What I mean here, for example, is the training and competence framework, where you're acquiring a firm, got a set of advisors, maybe dozens of advisors, hundreds of advisors. They're used to a specific framework. They have a specific remuneration structure, KPIs and so forth. What's that going to look like for them when they come over? You don't want them to be leaving necessarily because they've got that client relationship. So that whole culture thing really needs to be looked at. Likewise, the management integration, it's making it clear, ideally from the get-go, of what that's going to look like, where sometimes we see the target firms envisaging that they will be managers in the new structure, and then it transpires that they're not, which can be an upset. Other areas in respect of this are, as I say, the T&C framework. So it's a case of, what's it going to look like for those advisors when they come over? Often we see it is a very good model to have them start again from the get-go. Well, not start again totally, but at least start again in respect of the acquiring firm structure, if the deal is structured in such a way. But that can be a jerk for the actual advisors themselves, a jerk in the sense of they're not going to appreciate that, or that's not going to fit with them. However, clear communication throughout the process, where the advisors start to become involved in the consideration, can address that and smooth it over greatly. And I guess overarching the whole thing, it's a case of the two firms meeting together. What does the culture of the firm that you're acquiring look like in terms of the fit for the acquirer, full stop? And we see that borne out quite often in the quality of the advice. Likewise, the compliance framework, the systems and controls. It's all fair and well having a policy suite, but where the firms are actually adhering to it, following it, as I say, culture from the top, and then borne out in the advice that's given, compliant advice, or however it may fit, we see a great bear through in that. So culture is an absolutely critical aspect to look at. If any, an early doors red flag.
It's probably also appropriate to consider the status of the firm. Now, most advice firms these days are regarded by the regulator, certainly under Consumer Duty, as being both product manufacturers and distributors. And you need to consider how the roles they fulfill, and more particularly how you expect the roles that they will fulfill once the integration, if that's your intention, is actually taken forward. That will include consideration of their current platform arrangements to ensure that the best business synergies can be achieved and that the clients are kept entirely engaged and happy with the service that they're being provided. Consideration of a central investment proposition and whether the firm that you are acquiring may already have those sorts of facilities in place. They're all things that need to be looked at in the context too of an outfit that might describe itself as being wholly independent or proudly independent. It could raise questions in terms of conflicts if they have a considerable number of their clients, and particularly their new clients, being advised purely to go into a central investment proposition that they manage themselves.
Flaggy areas also can include introducer arrangements. Has the target firm used introducers? Are they regulated or not? If not, does the arrangement fall within the exemptions? What is communicated by the introducers? Are they doing financial promotions? Are they giving advice effectively? Is there a fee paid to introducers? Is it recurring? What is it based on? Are they compliant? All considerations that need to be looked at. The fallout can be that any non-compliance by introducers can result in the FCA taking action against the firm, as we've seen in recent years. So absolutely key. And it also dives into the financials as well. We have come across firms where they've got an introducer arrangement in place, long-standing, with a professional introducer, and they've been paying away up to 50% of the revenue, of the recurring revenue for the clients introduced for many years. So it's definitely an area that needs looking at. Well, I guess overarching even more so, as we said from the get-go, what is the actual post-acquisition integration strategy? And setting that out from the start, or is it a case that it's going to be changing down the line? We're talking here about, is the acquirer looking to hive the business up and bring it into their current structure and close down the firm that they're acquiring? Or are they going to be buying and building and letting them run completely independently, but separate on their own thing, or using a central compliance framework, a central investment proposition, all considerations that need to be taken into account, particularly in respect of the compliance due diligence that's going to be undertaken. Because as you can imagine, it bears out. If you're going to leave that firm to run post-acquisition, you want to be very, very confident that its compliance systems and controls are fully fit for purpose. However, if you're bringing it in-house, hiding it up, it's not quite so important because they're going to be moving on to the in-house structure. So that also, as I say, bears the focus and intensity of what is undertaken on the regulatory due diligence.
Perhaps the last 2 points in this particular part of our discussion is, and Alex has touched on it already, the future management structure, and in particular the senior manager, the FCA approved senior manager roles within the firms. What's going to happen to those on completion? Generally, we see a couple of new appointments to the board of an acquired firm to ensure that there's appropriate control in the acquisition, and by the same token, perhaps a new SMF 16 or 17 being put in place. The last point I suppose I would make in this regard is not particularly regulatory related, but the bottom line is sustainable revenues, income streams and recurring income. Obviously, there's an economic driver to the vast majority of these transactions, and this would form part of the financial due diligence. But clearly, you need to have an eye on ensuring that whatever your proposals are and forecasts, they aren't going to run contrary to the expectations of the regulator from a consumer duty and a treating customers fairly perspective.
Thank you. Other considerations, reputation, risk appetite. We talked at the beginning very early, what is your risk appetite? What does it look like post-acquisition? Are you going to be staying within the risk appetite? Are you looking to increase it? Are you potentially looking to decrease it? So in respect of, for example, the defined benefit pension transfer area, we know it's been a hot topic for a few years now. We've seen the intensity with the British Steel. Let's see what that looks like in the future with other schemes. If it's a case that you don't currently have any, as an acquirer, you don't currently have a DB book, or you've got a very clean DB book, are you looking to, if you like, put a few drips of ink into that clean bucket and sully it? It needs to be taken into account. What kind of cover are you going to have for that? Where does the acquirer have a sufficient framework to contain the scale of what you're taking on? X new advisors, Y new clients, Z new products. Do you have a sufficient framework in place for it? Or if you're not looking to move it in-house and you're leaving it with those firms, do they have a sufficient framework to scale up? Perhaps you're moving other firms into those firms. All needs to be looked at. And when we talk wider on that, in terms of what those firms look like, how does the DFM solution look like? Well, when we talk here, we mean the investment management. We're talking about the MiFID aspect. So is it in-house? Is it a panel? What are the conflicts? What MiFID pre-considerations do you have? For example, is it an investment firm group? And the red cap implications that can have. We'll come on to that later. But we've also got things such as conflicts of interest. My colleague talks about independent. And if you've got a central investment proposition in your own DFM, what percentage are you then putting into it? Is it in the 90%, the 80%? How do you justify that? How do you mitigate that? How do you evidence to the regulator that you're looking outside and you are truly whole of market and truly independent? Is the pricing of it such that it's artificially low and effectively leading your advisors to choose that? Again, what's the consideration for that? How does that come into the price and value assessment? So these are all key areas that need looking at in respect of that compliance due diligence when you're looking to make that acquisition.
If we move now to the key regulatory considerations, so where the first part of our discussion was really almost holding a mirror up to yourselves in terms of what your strategy was and your expectations and what you were looking for, we're going to delve a little bit more closely into what we consider when we are looking at a proposed target to be the vital aspects to lift the lid on.
And I guess to start with any regulated firm is the threshold conditions. Likewise, from the initial journey any of these firms would have taken when they applied for authorization to maintaining that authorization going forward. Does the firm meet the threshold conditions, particularly resource? Does it have sufficient financial resource and non-financial resource? And suitability in respect of the FCA's spin on it, the ability for the FCA to actually monitor and have oversight over that firm. And we've seen in recent times, actually very recent times, prudential team interaction in that, for example, where you've got offshore structures and the FCA's ability to have oversight on that. So, meeting those threshold conditions, absolutely a key point.
As part of that, we would expect a permission gap analysis to be undertaken. Purely commonsensical, you can't be picking up responsibilities, particularly if you are looking to hive up business. You can't be picking up a firm that either has additional permissions or products which you would not be able to support in the future. So a gap analysis that will either reinforce the synergies that you are expecting through product similarities and differences perhaps, but also ensuring that you can take care of any T&C changes that are required in the project plan. There is also the need for you to support legacy product provision in the target business. So you do need to be looking beyond day-to-day activity that's taking place in that entity and ensuring that you are appropriately prepared to drive matters forward in the future.
Also, other areas of key consideration, as you may have seen, regulatory firms of you out there, AML, financial crime prevention, big focus area of the FCA in recent months, recent weeks, really upping the ante. You might think here, well, hang on a minute, it's UK advised clients, it's annual face-to-face at the minimum interaction, face-to-face interaction at onboarding, very little execution only, if any. Although, yes, it may go on to DFN, but still you've got that advice piece typically. However, we're seeing the FCA get increasingly aggressive around AML, particularly around these business-wide risk assessments, individual client risk assessments, and are firms doing them? Unfortunately, we find that many firms don't. It's been, as I say, we're a UK client, UK fallout. However, we've seen the FCA, as I say, getting very hot with it. Most recently, last week, 8th of November, dear CEO, and wealth management firms and stockbroking firms also, what are your controls in this space? We're going to be intrusive. We're starting to knock on doors, etc. Fines, skilled person reviews. So where does this dove into here? It's essentially where we're looking at these firms. It's ensuring that a good look is had at their AML framework.
We've got acquisition due diligence on our radar as well, and this extends to those acquisitions which the target firm has previously made. Now, if they've acquired a business 10 years ago, it's probably fairly safe to assume that any complaints or poor advice fallouts would have materialized by the time you look at the firm. However, it is important to ensure that you do have a full understanding of what acquisitions have been made, the nature of the acquisitions. Were they asset purchases, in which case the legacy risk is perhaps somewhat mitigated, as long as the firm has been appropriately wound down? Or were they equity purchases? And if they were equity purchases, what due diligence was undertaken at the time of that acquisition to ensure that appropriate warranties and indemnities were perhaps put in place, or that steps were taken to mitigate legacy risk issues or high-risk products?
Other areas, just coming on to this FCA scrutiny and what we're seeing, sub-15s. So what are we talking about there? So Principle 11 of the FCA, open and honest with the regulator, and particularly where there's an asset purchase. So, diving back, what are we looking at here? You're acquiring a firm. Well, it doesn't have to be acquiring the whole firm. It could be just acquiring the client base. Quite often, a deal will start as an equity purchase, and then it will move to if it hasn't looked quite so rosy on aspects of the compliance DD, it may move to an asset purchase at a later stage. In respect of that, and where that does happen, there's a great expectancy from the regulator that the vendor will make what's called a sub-15, that being sub-15 Annex 4 of the FCA handbook, a notification to the regulator that we are selling our client base. Likewise, the FCA's expectation is that the acquirer would make a reciprocal sub 15 also, but certainly the vendor, should do. Where 18 months ago, even 12 months ago, we were seeing very little response from the FCA to these, wait your 30 days, fine, nothing comes back. Now it's a different picture. The FCA, as I said at the get-go, the frequency of these M&A deals just increasing and increasing and increasing. The frequency of asset deals is increasing. The FCA is becoming increasingly scrutinizing in that respect. They want to be confident that there's no phoenixing, for example. And so they're picking up on these sub-15s, inviting the acquirer and vendor quite often to have a conversation around it. What are the reasons behind the move over? Is it, clarifying, is it actually an asset purchase that you're looking to do? Because they don't necessarily see it at the point of submission, depending on what was put in the submission. Who will be taking on the liabilities post-transaction? How are they going to sit? Perhaps they're fully covered with PI, as we see quite often. They want to get an idea of that, if it is the case, actually see the PI coverage. They want to see the structure charts for the acquirer. They want to see the complaints registers and the actual framework of how complaints are going to be handled. They also want to know whether the vending firm has advised on any high-risk products. And if that's the case, what's the coverage for those going forward? So definitely a relevant area there, and not one to be shied away from. And if anything, you want to have a solid game plan before you make that sub 15, making sure as an acquirer that all those various different areas being considered during your compliance due diligence journey to ensure that you're able to make, and also the vendor is able to make, an application, or so to say, a notification that meets what the FCA would expect to see.
I think, Alex, it's probably fair to suggest that what we've seen in the sub-15 space is that there's almost been a move away from the principle-based regulator approach to being far more hands-on. So Alex mentioned a number of requirements that have been made of firms who have submitted sub-15s. One of those I'm aware of covered consumer duty, where the sub-15 essentially stated that the vendor firm had done a significant amount of work had been undertaken in respect of consumer duty, and the FCA's response was fantastic. Can you provide us with a copy of the documentation that sets out the work that's been undertaken and the conclusions that have been reached? So consumer duty, it's upon us and is absolutely at the forefront or at the top of the FCA's radar in how they are approaching these matters. So if you are considering an acquisition, it isn't a once and done setup in terms of have you complied with consumer duty. It really is about lifting the lid in terms of value assessments and the like.
I mentioned earlier briefly prudential capital arrangements. So where you are making an acquisition, really important to know what prudential category the firm is in. For example, in the wealth management space, typically IFAs, as they're often referred to, even if they're not independent, but still IFAs are not MiFID firms. They're Article 3 MiFID exempt firms. However, if they have permission to deal as agents, perhaps because they're using platforms, or they have investment management permissions that they may not even be using or are using, or they have CAS permissions, again, which they may not be using or are using, they're a MiFID firm, which brings with it other complexities in respect of the prudential capital arrangements. For example, if you've got a suite of firms that you own in your group without a MiFID firm in there, and you suddenly add a MiFID firm in, if you don't address the structure correctly, it can quite easily be the case that you've formed an investment firm group under MiFID Pro, in which case you need to look wide, and you're going to have a situation that you need to look at the overheads across the whole group, sum it up for your fixed overheads into the requirements for the MiFID Pro firm and so forth. Jumping out of the finer points there, we've seen in recent months with change of control applications, so where firms are making the whole equity purchase on a given entity, they put in their change of control application to the FCA change of control team, where 12 months ago, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, albeit it was taking quite a bit of time to get picked up, however, they were generally going through without prudential intervention, if you like. Now, it's a flip side. We're seeing the prudential team at the FCA open the conversation with that. What are you doing? What's your modelling in respect of the cap post-acquisition? What's it going to look like? Oh, we spot you've got a minority holding in a MiFID-proof firm. How are you capturing that in your numbers? Are you doing it correctly? So real intrusion there, to the degree that if it's not done properly, it can knock the deal out. So yeah, a key area to look at. Likewise, actually, even if it doesn't include a MiFID firm, we do see firms not calculating their regulatory capital correctly. For example, professional indemnity insurance, where you do have that insurance, if you have excesses over £5,000, that then impacts the reg cap, and you have to hold additional. So all considerations that need to be taken into account. Typically, yes, that's going to fall under your financial due diligence. However, us as a firm, I mean, we're super strong on the prudential side. We do also look at that aspect as an early doors red flag.
In terms of compliance landmines and the navigation thereof, Alex has already mentioned professional indemnity insurance in respect of the potential impact that it can have on regulatory capital requirements. But going back to the intentions or the strategy you wish to follow following acquisition, there is obviously a very strong case for runoff cover to be put in place. But even prior to getting to that point, which would be post-completion, looking at the PII a firm has got in place, and more particularly the exclusions, the excesses, and the limits, to ensure that whatever advice has been given is actually covered. What we are seeing, and you will doubtless be aware of this, is a differentiation between the level of cover available under a policy in its entirety, and then perhaps there might be a considerably lower level in respect of certain activities such as defined benefit pension transfer. And then within that, there may be specific exclusions around British Steel, anyone under the age of 50, or insistent clients. So in addition to the usual product exclusions that we see, Arch Crew and the like, it is worth ensuring that the book of business that you are looking to take on is currently insured. And we have come across examples where firms have given up their transfer permissions and they haven't insured their DB liability, their legacy liability. They haven't advised the regulator in this regard. And the minefield that a potential acquirer is walking into is the fact that it's going to be extremely difficult to get that legacy advice insured, certainly at a reasonable cost.
Absolutely. Other areas of key red flags, if you like, complaints handling, training. Is the firm aware of what a complaint looks like? Not rocket science, but quite often a firm will state when you're doing due diligence, we have very few, we have none, the complaint register is empty. Those are flags alone. It's like what training is undertaken. Or they have many at the other side of it. What root cause analysis is done? How are you then addressing it? How are you ensuring that they don't occur again? So that recording of the complaints is very important, and a lot to be borne out from those. Likewise, as I mentioned earlier, where firms have appointed representatives, and the appointed representative may have left many years earlier, there's the risk that complaints can come down the line. Many of these, in respect of acquisitions, you're going to put cover in place in respect of warranties and indemnities and so forth. Likewise, regulatory breaches and the reporting of them, actually more so than complaints. It's often the case where we're doing due diligence on sort of the smaller and mid-sized firms where they don't feel they've had a reg breach as such, and they have an empty register, which doesn't bear well in terms of the systems and controls the firm's got in place and the management's consideration of them. And again, it is a flaggy area that needs looking into, and quite often, training into firms. Likewise, change management. How has the firm dealt with as we know these days, this non-stop, relentless sweeps of new regulation that are coming through? July we had consumer duty. My colleague talked there about the FCA now using it as a stick, if you like, to beat firms with. But more to the point, how have firms actually embedded it? What does their implementation plan look like, and so forth? What's their gap analysis across it? We've had, of course, MiFID II quite a few years ago now, but those DFM firms and the various elements that do apply to the non-MiFID firms, what are they doing there? AML5, we talked about AML, how are they looking there? I mentioned that Dear CEO letter last week. Likewise, any other that applies to firms. Are the board doing a gap analysis, top to bottom, on the Dear CEOs? What's their consideration of it? Do they have any gaps? How are they going to address those? Are they material gaps or not? What's their action plan to address them if there are any? All areas that need looking at.
I mentioned at the start the need for you to be clear about your risk appetite when considering acquisitions. And when we consider higher risk products, perhaps even illiquid, non-standard investments or complex products, that's exactly what I was referring to, because in themselves, they may be part of a very well-organized and comprehensive wealth management advice service that is provided to clients. And as long as there are the appropriate training and competence balances and monitoring in place, in themselves, that may not be an issue. However, going back to the point I made about ensuring the ability to provide support and ongoing advice in respect of legacy advice and legacy products, these are aspects that need to be borne in mind to ensure that you aren't put in a position where you are suddenly trying to make do and satisfy client requirements without being adequately pre-prepared and on the front foot.
Okay, so you've decided you want to acquire the firm, and you've got to the point that you actually need to make a change of control application to the FCA, because we all know to change the ownership of an FCA firm through certain bands, in non-MiFID firms 20%, MiFID firms 10, 20, 30, 50%. So certainly for 100% acquisition, you need approval from the FCA, otherwise it's a criminal offence. So you're at the point where you're going to make that change of control application, and it's gone into the FCA. So what we're seeing now is, as I mentioned earlier, there can be a degree of pushback from the Prudential team. We've also got a situation in terms of liabilities and how that's going to look, and where, for example, firms are going to be closed down post-acquisition, how those liabilities are going to look. Great consideration in respect of the reg cap and what the framework for that looks like and how that's going to be maintained all the way out to the submission requires 3-year financials to go in, and how that's going to look across the whole group structure.
If we move on now to a few of our best practice aspects that we can talk through. If we were having this conversation 2 years ago, and Alex mentioned the fact that a lot of acquisitions start out as an equity deal, that's what's proposed and on the table. However, once the lid has been lifted and possibly a can of worms revealed, then the default was to go to trade and asset, and it was fairly short and sweet. It possibly brought with it a few more challenges from a vendor tax perspective, but they could be dealt with an appropriate time lag introduced, as it were. Our best practice advice, particularly when it comes to trade and asset purchases, is to ensure that you get FCA approval for the application to deauthorize the business that you are acquiring before you complete. In the current climate, we don't think that there's a better way to ensure that you perhaps avoid the potential for legacy liabilities creeping up on you in the future.
Other areas include, as my colleague mentioned earlier, insurance. Well, it's ensuring that you keep the insurer well informed throughout the process to ensure that any run-off cover that you're looking to have will be provided, and it's going to be sufficient breadth. Absolutely keep them engaged throughout the process.
We also would suggest that you choose those who are going to be assisting with your legal due diligence very wisely. The importance of warranties and indemnities in the SPA cannot be understated, and obviously you'd be looking for the most comprehensive and enduring protection in that contractual agreement as possible.
Also, best practice, managing the, as I mentioned earlier, but diving into a little bit more detail here, managing the advisor transition into the acquirer's operating model, including the training and competence, the loyalty, and getting their buy-in. The last thing you want is advisors being, as I said earlier, sort of having a jerk experience and leaving and potentially taking the clients with them, because they do have that relationship after non-competes and so forth. So that cultural alignment piece within the acquiring and target firm. So, you know, looking to really do the work to ensure that, you know, that jigsaw fits together nicely.
And then if we just move on to, I'm conscious of the time and the fact that we may well have a few questions already. In terms of a case study, there's perhaps one that I would like to highlight because it demonstrates where an acquirer had set out on an acquisition. We did the buy-side due diligence, and unfortunately the target firm had a defined benefit pension transfer legacy problem. I think there were about 90 cases that they had. We did an initial sample. It was advice that went back to 15, 16, 17. So using the FCA's DBAT, advisors are in a very difficult position, should we say, to get suitable outcomes evidenced by those legacy files. The long and the short of it was we were then engaged directly by the target firm, and over the next 12 months, we worked through their legacy DBT book. They met with clients, they updated their fact finds and client objectives for the transfers, etc., etc. There was an acceptance that they could never make that advice suitable. That ship had sailed, and the vendor was aware of that, as was the acquirer. However, 14 months later, having given the DBT book a good shakedown and dealt with any particularly unsuitable cases, and I think in the end there were about 7 unsuitable cases where cards were shown to the clients effectively, PI were kept fully informed of the process, an equity, I beg your pardon, yes, a share deal, an equity purchase was actually concluded 14 months later, and the acquirer was comfortable that they had a very good understanding of the potential liability that they were picking up as part of the deal. And I think that that's what we are essentially trying to achieve, that if we can put a number on that potential liability, then people can get comfortable with it and ensure that it is appropriately catered for in all of the warranties and indemnities and the agreements. Do we have questions, or is there
We have had some questions come in, but ahead of doing the questions, we've got another quick poll which we'd like to ask our audience. So to help further develop our webinar plan going forward, we'd like to find out the key topics that you'd like to learn about and have us discuss. So we'll just launch this poll now. If you can please take a few moments to let us know if any of these areas would be of interest to you. These are multiple choice, it's a multiple choice question, so by all means pick more than one. We'll leave it on for a few more seconds, and we'll close it off now, and we'll go into the questions. So we've had a question coming here. You've mentioned legacy DB advice risk. We've heard that the FCA had diverted resources from this aspect, and particularly the BSPS redress scheme to Consumer Duty. So is it fair to surmise that this issue is getting less attention?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think if I was asked that question probably 3 months ago, my attitude or my opinion would be slightly different, in as much as I think it's widely accepted that the redress program that was put in place for the BSPS advice hasn't yielded quite the level of redress that a number of commentators, and I think it's probably fair to say the FCA itself was expecting. We are aware that the FCA apparently moved resource off the BSPS project onto Consumer Duty, and that is quite understandable in the circumstances. So, as I say, a few months ago, I might have said that DBTs were perhaps dropping down the priority list. However, just going back to the conversations or the points that were made about sub 15 notifications, and the fact that the FCA is being somewhat more front foot in dealing with the potential for legacy liabilities and complaints and high risk products, etc. I don't think it's fair to suggest that DB advice has fallen down the list of priorities for consideration.
Thank you very much. Next question. How important do you regard it for firms to be receiving ongoing third-party compliance advice and support?
I'll take that one. So much depends on what their current compliance and risk management arrangements are. We do deal with a number of firms that are absolutely capable and very effective in how they manage their compliance exposure or regulatory risk exposure. Where it is perhaps advantageous to have a third party involved is where there's perhaps low staff turnover. So you might have the same 2 or 3 advisors who've worked together for 15 years. The chance of somebody stepping in and highlighting to them that they've perhaps fallen behind the FCA's expectations, which are continuing to evolve and develop, and certainly with Consumer Duty, we're seeing another step change, as it were. The reality is, it depends on the firm itself, and particularly the culture. Do they do horizon scanning and regulatory? Are they resourced appropriately in a compliance team?
Perfect. And you mentioned multipliers coming under pressure. What sort of multipliers are we generally seeing?
I'll take that one. So based on EBITDA, we're seeing below 2 million EBITDA 6 to 7 times multiplier. In the sort of 2 to 5 million range, we're seeing 7 to 10 times, and over 5 million. We're seeing over 5 million EBITDA, we're seeing 10 times, and even plus, 10 times plus. It's starting to get into the double digits, low double digits.
Perfect. And in your experience, what are the most common causes for deals falling through during the due diligence phase of the transaction?
I'll take that one. I guess numerous, really. we're seeing I guess the key one is the quality of advice. So be it whether it's DB or defined benefit pension transfers or just general investment advice. So where we're doing those reviews early doors, where there's a high proportion of unsuitable or a very high proportion of unclear or MIG, that can be a deal breaker, or it can be a shift to an asset purchase. Poor record keeping. What we see with poor record keeping is that where you're doing those file reviews, it can be a case that you're not able to get a result out of it. You're not able to get to suitable or unsuitable. It's just a case of unclear, or in the case of a DB, MIG. So it makes it a real struggle. And where you can see it where you've got a vending firm struggling to get a client file together. Doesn't happen a lot, but it happens occasionally. And that can certainly be a deal breaker. Deal fatigue. Sometimes these deals can be elongated in terms of the amount of time. Unfortunately, it can be a situation that firms that are vending have been in that position for quite some time, where you would, because of that, expect them to be in good order for potential acquirers. It may not be the case, and that can cause it to fall to the wayside. But also, I guess that fatigue where sort of where the negotiations get extrapolated out to the nth degree. Other areas, I guess, breakdown of trust between the parties, where one had said, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and that turned out not to be the case. That can certainly knock it into touch.
Thank you. So another person asked you, I'm looking at a client bank / asset purchase. The clients are currently managed by a sole trader who is an appointed representative. My company is directly authorized. Other than the sub 15, what key issues should I be concerned about, including any regulatory actions or notifications?
I think the fact that you're looking at a client bank that is currently under a principal firm, they would have responsibility for all of the regulatory advice and the like that has been delivered in the past. Certainly a sub 15 notification in terms of acquisition of that client book. And going back to some of the points we made a little bit earlier, I think my suggestion would be to ensure that the sub 15 submission is comprehensive in terms of how the clients are going to be catered for going forward. It's a little bit from a regulatory perspective. That's probably the long and the short of it. I suppose the question is whether the advisor is going to follow into your directly authorized firm, and whether the intention is for him or her to become or they to become a director, because there may be the need to get approval, and if they've given advice in respect of defined benefit pension transfers in the past, there may be certain hurdles to be dealt with. But I'm just looking across to Alex, wondering whether there's anything else that we need to be aware of or mention.
I think that's a fairly good coverage there.
Thank you. I think we've got time just for actually, for sake of time, for one more question. The person who answered that question has given a bit of follow-up. No advisor will not be joining us. A handover period only when they won't be able to advise.
That perhaps makes things a little bit more straightforward then.
Yeah, perfect. So I think we've got time for one more question. What in your experience view on the FCA expectations for a change in control communication? Is it exactly the percentage and above, or would the FCA expect communication if it were a few percent below the threshold shareholding that changed?
Okay, so I'll take that one. So the requirement to make a submission is if it's at the percentage or above, in terms of to seek approval, because you need to get approval. If the change is below the threshold, then it's a case that you would just make a notification. So the normal way to do it is the CIC address at the FCA, just to let them know that a change has taken place. You need to be a little bit careful around the percentage thresholds. It can seem obvious, but the legislation kind of extends, I'd say, wider than Companies Act. For example, an individual can be construed as an undertaking. So, for example, if you've got an individual who already has 50% and they're going up, they can get, basically, it can require them to make a new submission for approval because they're being deemed a parent undertaking, even as an individual, which is very obscure, but it's the case, even though they're already at the 50% or more band. But the fact that they're now going to step above 50%. So to answer your question specifically, if you're below, it's not an issue, just a high FCA, this is the change, thank you very much, and they typically won't come back. But if it's at or above, you're going to need to seek approval.
Thank you. And we've had a couple of people ask, like, will the presentation be, the slides be sent out afterwards? So this session is actually being recorded, and we're putting the recording online soon. And thank you very much to not only our panelists, but also everyone who gave us our time and attended today. Please follow Thistle Initiatives on LinkedIn to see when this becomes available to watch. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.